May 14, 1916, a ranch in the Mexican desert near Rubio, Chihuahua. December 16, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge has just erupted across the Ardennes forest. Inside the cramped turret of an M4 Sherman tank, General George S. Patton climbs aboard to inspect his men before the Third Army's legendary pivot north to rescue Bastogne. As he swings his leg over the hatch, something catches the winter light. Not the standard-issue combat boots that every other soldier in the European theater is wearing. Not the specialized tanker boots that Patton himself helped design 7 years earlier, but tall, gleaming cavalry boots with 3 leather straps buckled up the sides, boots designed for riding horses, boots from a war that ended 26 years ago. For the next 4 months, as the Third Army drives through the Ardennes, across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany, Patton will wear these same boots every single day. He'll wear them climbing in and out of tanks, wading through mud, standing in snow and accepting German surrenders. Everyone around him, from privates to generals, wears modern combat boots, but not Patton. The question isn't just why he wore cavalry boots in a Sherman tank. The question is why he could never take them off. To understand why a 4-star general commanding the most mobile army in Europe refused to change his footwear, you need to know 3 things about George S. Patton Jr. First, these weren't just any cavalry boots. They were Model 1940 cavalry field boots with 3 adjustable buckle straps up the leg, officially issued to mounted cavalry officers from 1920 through 1942. Patton had been wearing boots like these since he graduated from West Point in 1909 as a second lieutenant in the 15th Cavalry. That's 35 years of muscle memory, 35 years of identity. Second, Patton himself had co-designed the modern tanker boot in 1937. Working with H.E. Ketzler from Diener's Boot Company, he created specialized footwear specifically for tank crews. Boots with leather strap closures instead of laces so they wouldn't tangle in machinery. Boots that could be kicked off quickly in a fire. The Army adopted them. Tank crews loved them. Patton never wore them. Not once in 4 years of commanding armored divisions. Third, by the time America entered World War II in December 1941, the horse cavalry was essentially dead. The last mounted cavalry charge against tanks had occurred just days after Pearl Harbor in the Philippines, ending in catastrophic failure. The Army officially deactivated most horse cavalry units by March 1942. The era of riding into battle had ended. But Patton kept riding, metaphorically at least, in his cavalry boots in his custom-tailored jodhpurs, carrying his ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, just as he had in 1916, chasing Pancho Villa through Mexico. The uniform of a cavalryman, worn by a man commanding 500,000 soldiers and 2,000 tanks. George Smith Patton Jr. was born into military aristocracy in 1885 near Los Angeles, California. His grandfather, Colonel George Patton, had been killed fighting for the Confederacy during the Civil War. His great-uncle was Hugh Mercer, a brigadier general in the Continental Army. Patton grew up on stories of glory and sacrifice, reading Homer's Iliad before bedtime, convinced that warriors were born, not made. He was also severely dyslexic at a time when nobody understood what that meant, forcing him to memorize entire textbooks by having them read aloud. He didn't learn to read until age 12, but he could ride a horse at age 5. At West Point, Patton was intense, ambitious, and unnaturally focused on becoming a great warrior. He was also a natural horseman. In 1912, he represented the United States at the Stockholm Olympics in the modern pentathlon, a competition designed to test the skills of the ideal cavalry officer. Swimming, cross-country running, pistol shooting, fencing, and show jumping, he finished 5th overall, and then traveled to France to study advanced cavalry saber techniques. When he returned to the United States, he redesigned the Army's entire saber doctrine and personally oversaw the forging of a new cavalry saber known as the Model 1913 Patton saber. For the next 2 decades, American cavalry officers would train with a weapon that bore his name. But here's the contradiction that makes Patton fascinating. In 1916, as a young lieutenant chasing Pancho Villa's forces through Mexico, Patton led what he claimed was the first motorized attack in American military history. Using 3 Dodge touring cars to ambush and kill several of Villa's men, including his bodyguard Julio Cardenas. Patton understood technology. He wasn't a dinosaur clinging to the past. And yet, when he fought that battle, He was wearing cavalry boots and carrying a custom Colt single-action army revolver with ivory grips and his initials engraved on them. Even then, at age 31, he was already building his persona as a warrior from a different age. The irony is that he was right about the cars and wrong about the methods, or perhaps right about both. The motorized vehicle proved its worth that day. So did the man in cavalry boots holding a revolver from the Old West. In World War I, Patton established and commanded the United States Tank Corps, becoming one of America's first tank officers. He was wounded in action in September 1918, took a bullet through his upper leg, and nearly died. When he returned home after the war, he spent the next 2 decades in what should have been career purgatory. The Army slashed its budget. Promotions froze. Officers who had been colonels in wartime became captains in peacetime, and the debate raged: horse or machine, saber or tank, tradition or innovation. Patton found himself caught between 2 worlds, and what he did next reveals everything about why he wore those boots until the day he died. In the 1920s and 1930s, the U.S. Army Cavalry faced an existential crisis. For centuries, mounted soldiers had been the mobile striking force of armies worldwide. Cavalry meant speed, shock, and the ability to exploit breakthroughs. But the First World War had introduced machine guns that could mow down horses and riders in seconds, barbed wire that stopped charges dead, and artillery that could shell cavalry positions from miles away. Most military theorists saw the writing on the wall. The horse was finished. Tanks were the future. But try telling that to men who had spent their entire lives in the saddle, men who believed to their core that the bond between horse and rider was irreplaceable, men for whom cavalry wasn't just a job, but an entire way of life. Major George S. Patton, stationed at Fort Myer in Virginia, commanding the 3rd Squadron, 3rd Cavalry, was one of those men. In 1922, he wrote in the Cavalry Journal about the spirit of the mounted warrior, describing the look in a cavalryman's eyes as he charges with drawn saber. His words are almost frightening in their intensity. The fierce frenzy of hate and determination, flashing from the bloodshot eyes squinting behind the glittering steel, is what wins. This wasn't nostalgia, this was identity. And throughout the 1930s, as the debate over mechanization intensified, Patton wrote article after article defending the horse cavalry. In 1930, when a cadet offered him a ride in a dilapidated Ford, Patton reportedly snarled, "Write that goddamn thing? If I was post commander, I wouldn't even allow it on post." His contempt for mechanization seemed absolute. But Patton was more complicated than that. In a 1930 Cavalry Journal article, co-written with Major Clarence C. Benson, Patton acknowledged that mechanized vehicles couldn't be ignored. "To bury our heads ostrich-like and ignore them would be foolish," he wrote. But in the same breath, he argued that cavalry could adapt to the modern battlefield. If the 14th century knight could adapt himself to gunpowder, we should have no fear of oil, grease, and motors. He was, as one historian later described it, riding the fence. He championed horses publicly while privately studying tank warfare. He wore his cavalry uniform and boots while taking flying lessons to observe mechanized maneuvers from the air. He was preparing for 2 futures simultaneously because he genuinely didn't know which one would prevail. The crisis came to a head in May 1940 during the Louisiana maneuvers, massive war games designed to test horse cavalry against mechanized forces. Patton, now a colonel commanding horse cavalry at Fort Myer, quietly fed intelligence to his friend Major General Kenyon Joyce, who commanded the horse units in the exercise. Patton even got himself appointed as an umpire so he could watch what happened. What happened was humiliation. General Abner Chaffee's mechanized force, using tanks disguised as combat cars to get around budget restrictions, consistently beat the horses to every objective. The horses couldn't match the speed, they couldn't cover the distances, they couldn't hold defensive positions against armored attacks. Even with Patton's inside information, the cavalry failed, and on the same day the American exercises ended. May 25, 1940, German panzer tanks completed their drive through France, forcing the British evacuation at Dunkirk. The lesson was brutally clear. Horses were obsolete. At the Alexandria, Louisiana High School on that final day of the maneuvers, an impromptu meeting occurred in the basement. General Chaffee was there. General Frank Andrews from the War Department General Staff was there, representing Chief of Staff George C. Marshall. And somehow, Colonel George S. Patton managed to be there too, even though General John K. Hare, the chief of cavalry and staunch horse advocate, was not invited despite being in Louisiana at the time. The conclusion was unanimous. The Army needed an independent armored force, no longer controlled by the cavalry branch. The horse cavalry would be disbanded. The age of the tank had arrived. Patton immediately reached out to Chaffee about transferring to the new armored force. Within months, he was commanding the 2nd Armored Brigade at Fort Benning, learning to fight in tanks instead of from saddles. The transformation should have been complete. But when Patton showed up to take command, he was still wearing his cavalry boots. Any rational observer would have expected Patton to adopt the uniform of his new role. He was now commanding an armored brigade, the cutting edge of modern warfare. His peers wore combat boots, or the new tanker boots. His subordinates wore combat boots. The entire army was standardizing footwear for mechanized combat. Tanker boots made sense. They had strap closures that wouldn't catch in machinery. They had all-leather construction resistant to fuel and hydraulic fluids. They were shorter than riding boots, providing better ankle mobility for men who would spend hours sitting in tanks. And Patton himself had helped design them specifically for this purpose. The man wasn't stupid. He knew what practical footwear looked like. But when he walked into his headquarters at Fort Benning, strapped into his command tank, or reviewed his troops in formation, he wore 3-buckle cavalry boots that reached halfway up his calf. The decision wasn't about functionality, it was about identity. Patton had spent 32 years as a cavalry officer. He had represented his country at the Olympics in cavalry events. He had designed the cavalry saber. He had commanded cavalry squadrons. He had written the doctrine. His entire professional identity, his entire sense of self, was built on the foundation of being a mounted warrior. The cavalry boots weren't just footwear, they were a statement. They said, "I am still a cavalryman, even if my horse is made of steel and runs on gasoline. The tank is not a new weapon. It is the evolution of cavalry, the natural successor to the horse, and I am the bridge between the old world and the new." This wasn't unique to Patton, though he was the most visible example. Many of the officers who commanded mechanized cavalry units in World War II had served in horse cavalry. Colonel Charles H. Reed, who commanded the 2nd Cavalry Group known as the Ghosts of Patton's Army, was a horseman. Many of his officers had served in mounted units before mechanization. Even the terminology reflected the connection. They weren't tank units, they were armored cavalry. The organizational structure mirrored cavalry formations. Squadrons, not battalions, troops, not companies. Reconnaissance in force, not infantry support. Speed, mobility, and exploitation of breakthroughs. This was cavalry doctrine applied to mechanized warfare. And if the doctrine survived, why shouldn't the uniform, why shouldn't the boots? But for Patton, there was a deeper layer. He believed, genuinely and without irony, that he had lived multiple past lives as a warrior. Say Roman legionary, a soldier under Napoleon, a cavalryman in the 100 Years' War. He studied the Bhagavad Gita alongside the Bible. He prayed to God before battles and consulted his belief in reincarnation when making strategic decisions. This wasn't eccentric spirituality. This was foundational to his worldview. He believed he was born to be a warrior, not in this life alone, but across centuries. And warriors didn't discard their symbols. A knight didn't give up his armor just because crossbows made it less effective. He adapted, he evolved, but he kept the symbols because the symbols mattered. They connected him to the unbroken chain of warriors, stretching back through time. When reporters asked Patton about his appearance, his theatrical uniform, his ivory-handled revolvers, and his cavalry boots, he had a standard answer. The soldier must be the best-dressed, best-equipped, best-trained man in his community. Morale, he argued, depended on visible leadership. Troops needed to see their commander, to identify him instantly, to know that he was with them and ahead of them. In the chaos of battle, when radio communications failed and smoke obscured everything, a commander needed to be recognizable. The shining helmet, the ivory pistols, the cavalry boots. These weren't vanity, they were leadership tools. They said, "I am here, follow me." And statistically, it worked. The Third Army under Patton's command had higher morale ratings, lower desertion rates, and faster operational tempos than comparable units. Whether his troops believed in his methods or simply believed in him is almost irrelevant. The results speak for themselves. But there's one more reason Patton kept his boots, and it's the most human one. He was 56 years old when America entered World War II. Most officers his age were in staff positions or heading toward retirement. Patton got to command armies in combat, living the dream he had held since childhood. But he also knew this was his last war. There wouldn't be another chance. And if this was his final performance on the stage of history, if this was the culmination of everything he had trained for and believed in, then he would wear the uniform of his choosing. Not the army's uniform, his uniform, the uniform of a warrior who saw himself as part of an ancient and honorable tradition. Combat boots were practical, tanker boots were sensible, but cavalry boots were who he was. November 8, 1942, Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Major General George S. Patton splashes ashore at Casablanca, in French Morocco, wearing his cavalry boots, his ivory pistols, and a steel helmet polished to a mirror shine. The landing is chaotic. French Vichy forces are resisting. Naval bombardments light up the coast, and through it all Patton strides across the beach in boots designed for riding horses, looking like he stepped out of a museum exhibit and into a modern amphibious assault. His staff thinks he's insane. His soldiers think he's magnificent. The enemy thinks they're facing a madman, which turns out to be tactically advantageous. For the next 3 years, those boots will cover extraordinary distances, from the deserts of Morocco to Tunisia, to the mountains of Sicily, from the beaches of Normandy to the hedgerows of France, to the forests of the Ardennes, to the banks of the Rhine River. Patton's Third Army will advance faster and farther than any other Allied army in Europe, covering distances that would have been impossible for horse cavalry, but utilizing cavalry principles: speed, aggression, reconnaissance in force, exploitation of breakthroughs, never stop moving, never let the enemy consolidate. Attack, attack, attack. And through every mile, every battle, every muddy field and bombed-out town, Patton wears his cavalry boots. The practical challenges are real. Sherman tanks are cramped. The commander's position in the turret requires climbing through a narrow hatch. Combat boots are low and flexible. Tanker boots are specifically designed for this environment. Cavalry boots are tall and rigid, making it harder to climb, harder to sit in confined spaces, harder to bail out quickly if the tank is hit. Patton doesn't care, he makes it work. His staff officers learn to help him into tanks. His orderlies keep the boots polished to a brilliant shine, even in muddy winter conditions. Photographers capture him climbing tank hatches, and every single image shows those distinctive, three-buckle cavalry boots catching the light. The boots become part of his mystique, inseparable from his image. When troops see him, they see the whole package. The helmet with 4 stars painted on, the ivory pistols, the riding breeches, the boots. It's a costume, yes, but it's also a signal. This man commands tanks, but thinks like a cavalry officer. He values speed over firepower, maneuver over attrition, boldness over caution. The uniform tells you how he'll fight before he even issues orders. And for an army that spent 1942 and early 1943 learning painful lessons about German combat effectiveness, Patton's aggressive cavalry mindset becomes exactly what's needed. December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last major offensive smashes into the American lines in Belgium, catching the Allies completely by surprise. 2 entire American divisions are surrounded at Bastogne, cut off and running out of ammunition, food and medical supplies. The situation is desperate. Eisenhower calls an emergency meeting of all senior commanders at Verdun on December 19th. When Eisenhower asks how quickly the various armies can counterattack, most generals say they need weeks to plan and reposition. Patton says he can attack in 48 hours. The other generals think he's lying or boasting. He's not. In the most audacious military maneuver of the war, Patton pivots the entire Third Army 90 degrees, moving 133,178 soldiers, 7,066 vehicles, and hundreds of tanks through winter conditions along icy roads, covering miles in darkness to hit the German southern flank exactly 48 hours after promising to do so. This is cavalry doctrine at mechanized scale. The speed, the boldness, the willingness to attack with incomplete information, trusting momentum over preparation. And when Patton arrives to personally oversee the relief of Bastogne, he's wearing his cavalry boots in the snow, climbing on Sherman tanks to check firing positions, walking through frozen mud to talk to forward units. The boots get caked in ice. His orderlies clean them every night. Photographers capture him at Bastogne in late December, the town smoking behind him, his breath visible in the frozen air, and his cavalry boots gleaming in the weak winter sunlight. The image becomes iconic. The general who refused to change his boots saved an entire army. The cavalry boots Patton wore from 1942 to 1945 walked through the liberation of thousands of concentration camp prisoners, including the survivors of Ohrdruf, one of the first camps discovered by American forces. They stood on the balcony when Patton accepted the surrender of German commanders. They carried him across the Rhine River in March 1945, the first time an American general had crossed that symbolic barrier since Napoleon. And they were on his feet when the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. In 4 years of mechanized warfare, commanding the most modern army in history, Patton never changed his footwear. The irony is rich. Patton had helped design the practical footwear that would have made his job easier. He knew the cavalry boots were impractical. He didn't care, because somewhere in his mind, he understood something profound about symbols and identity. You don't become a great tank commander by forgetting you were a cavalryman. You become a great tank commander by applying cavalry principles to mechanized warfare. The boots weren't anachronistic. They were connective tissue linking centuries of cavalry doctrine to modern armored operations. When military historians study the Third Army's campaigns, they see textbook cavalry operations executed with tanks, reconnaissance in force, rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, envelopment of enemy positions, constant aggressive forward movement. This isn't new doctrine. This is old doctrine applied to new technology. After the war ended, Patton remained in Germany as commander of the 15th Army, still wearing his cavalry boots. On December 9, 1945, his staff car collided with an army truck near Mannheim. Patton was paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days later, on December 21st, he died of a pulmonary embolism. He was 60 years old. The boots that had carried him through 2 world wars, from Mexico to France to North Africa to Germany, were finally taken off. They are now displayed at the Patton Museum in Fort Knox, Kentucky, along with his ivory pistols, his helmet, and his other personal effects. Museum visitors see them every day, polished and preserved behind glass. 3-buckle Model 1940 cavalry field boots that should have been obsolete by 1942, but instead became one of the most recognizable symbols in American military history. The boots outlived their original purpose, but fulfilled a deeper one. They reminded everyone who saw them that progress doesn't require abandoning tradition, that new technology doesn't erase old principles, that a warrior's identity matters as much as his weapons. Patton understood tanks better than almost any American general. He also understood horses, sabers, and the spirit of mounted combat. He didn't have to choose between them. He carried both forward, literally and figuratively, in those cavalry boots that never made sense but somehow made perfect sense. There's a question worth asking at the end of this story. Was Patton being stubborn, or was he being wise? Was his refusal to change boots the quirk of an eccentric general, or was it the choice of a man who understood that identity shapes capability? You could make the argument either way. The practical case against cavalry boots is overwhelming. They were harder to use in tanks. They were less suitable for the terrain. They were a safety risk in emergencies. Any logistics officer could have listed a dozen reasons why Patton should have switched to combat boots or the tanker boots he helped design. And yet, the Third Army moved faster, fought harder, and adapted more quickly than any other Allied force in Europe. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe there's something about maintaining your sense of self, about refusing to become purely practical, that preserves the intangible qualities that make great commanders great. We live in an era that prizes optimization above almost everything else. The most efficient solution, the most logical choice, the data-driven decision. And that approach has value, obviously, but Patton's boots are a reminder that human beings aren't purely rational machines. We draw strength from symbols. We define ourselves through choices that don't always make immediate practical sense, but that connect us to something deeper. Patton wasn't just commanding tanks. He was embodying a tradition, carrying forward a legacy, and expressing through his appearance a philosophy of warfare that valued audacity over caution, speed over firepower, and individual will over institutional conformity. The boots were impractical. They were also essential, not to his ability to give orders or read maps, but to his ability to be Patton, to project the image and mindset that made him effective. Think about your own life for a moment. What are your cavalry boots? What choices do you make that don't optimize for efficiency, but that preserve who you are? What symbols matter to you even when they don't make logical sense? We all have them. The tools we refuse to replace, the methods we insist on using, the parts of ourselves we won't modernize even when the world tells us we should. Sometimes that's stubborn nostalgia, sometimes it's wisdom. And the difference between the two might be whether those choices actually help us do what we're meant to do. Patton's boots helped him be Patton. That might be all the justification they ever needed. If this story resonates with you, I've created another video about military traditions that survived modernization. It's called The Last Cavalry Charge in World War II, and it covers the only successful mounted cavalry action against mechanized forces, which happened in the Philippines just after Pearl Harbor. You'll find it linked in the description, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. This channel explores the human decisions behind military history, the moments when individuals made choices that shaped nations. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss future stories. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons, but with the courage to remain who you are in a changing world.